Dim the lights and settle in. Tonight, we'll walk through stone corridors where whispers echo across centuries, where men who held the keys to heaven carried secrets that could unlock the gates of ruin. We'll trace the invisible thread that bound medieval priests to truths they could never speak aloud. Confessions written in cipher, buried in margins, or taken silently to the grave. This is a story of faith and doubt, of power wrapped in humility's cloak, of the immense burden of knowing too much in an age when knowledge itself could be heresy. The thesis we'll return to, again and again, is this: those who heard all confessions could confess to no one. Imagine a candle flame in a stone chamber. It flickers but never goes out, casting shadows that dance like memories on ancient walls. That candle is our guide tonight, a small light in an age of great darkness and greater mysteries. Hold its image in your mind as we begin. In the year of our Lord, when kingdoms were still finding their borders and the church was weaving itself into the fabric of every village and city, there arose a peculiar paradox. The priesthood, that sacred office meant to bridge earth and heaven, created men who existed between worlds. They were not quite of the people, for they had taken vows that separated them. They were not quite of the nobility, though many came from noble houses. They were not quite of God alone, for they lived among humanity's messiest truths. They heard everything: affairs and murders, thefts and blasphemies, the secret hungers of lords and the desperate sins of peasants. They heard it all in the confessional box, that wooden chamber where souls were bared and absolution granted. But who heard the confessions of the confessors? The medieval priest occupied a strange space in the social order. In a village, he might be the only man who could read and write. In a cathedral city, he might be one of dozens, a small part of an ecclesiastical machine that governs souls with the precision other institutions use to govern bodies. The priest said Mass, administered sacraments, baptized infants, married young lovers, anointed the dying, and buried the dead. He walked with every person from cradle to grave. He knew things. He knew which merchant cheated on his weights, which knight had a bastard child in the next village, which noblewoman whispered prayers to saints the church had never canonized, which young man harbored doubts about the resurrection. And he could tell no one. The seal of confession was absolute. It was not merely a rule or a guideline, it was sacred law, bound by oaths and backed by the threat of eternal punishment. A priest who broke the seal risked excommunication, which meant not just expulsion from his office, but damnation of his immortal soul. The logic was clear. If people could not trust the confessional to be truly secret, they would not confess. If they did not confess, their sins would go unabsolved. If their sins went unabsolved, they would die in a state of mortal sin and face judgment unprepared. The entire system of medieval salvation depended on this one promise: what you tell the priest stays with the priest forever. But what of the priest's own soul? What of his own doubts, his own fears, his own sins? He could confess to another priest, certainly. The system allowed for that, but what if his confession implicated his superior? What if his doubts touched upon doctrine itself? What if the knowledge he carried from other confessions pressed upon his conscience like a weight too heavy to bear? The medieval sources, sparse as they are on this intimate subject, give us glimpses. Letters hidden in monastery archives, marginalia in theological texts, the careful records of church courts where priests stood accused of breaking their vows. From these fragments, we can reconstruct a hidden landscape of inner torment. Let us start in a small parish church somewhere in France in the 11th century. The building is simple: thick stone walls, a packed earth floor, wooden benches worn smooth by generations of penitents. Narrow windows let in thin streams of light that catch the dust motes drifting through the air. There is a smell of wax and wool, of unwashed bodies and damp stone, of incense struggling to mask earthier scents. The priest's name is lost to history, but let us call him Father Benedict, for that was a common name then, and it means Blessed One, which carries its own quiet irony. Father Benedict has served this parish for 12 years. He knows every family, every field, every feud. When he walks through the village, people bow their heads or avert their eyes, not from reverence alone, but from the knowledge that he knows them, truly knows them, in ways their own spouses and parents do not. He knows that the blacksmith beats his wife when he drinks. He knows that the miller's daughter is pregnant by the Lord's son. He knows that the widow who brings him eggs every Sunday once tried to poison her husband with foxglove, though the old man died of fever before the poison could take effect. He knows that the young man who serves as his acolyte lies awake at night, wrestling with desires that the church calls abominable. Father Benedict keeps all these secrets locked inside himself. He celebrates Mass with steady hands. He preaches homilies about virtue and sin, about the mercy of God and the justice that awaits the unrepentant. His voice never wavers. His face reveals nothing. But, late at night, alone in his small room behind the church, he lights a candle and sits at a rough wooden table with a cup of sour wine and a crust of bread. And he feels the weight of all that knowledge pressing down upon his chest until he can barely breathe. He has his own confessor, of course, a priest in the nearest market town, a day's walk away. Once a month, Father Benedict makes that walk, confesses his own small sins, a moment of pride, a flash of anger, a lustful thought about a parishioner's daughter, and receives absolution. But he cannot confess the burden itself. He cannot say, "Father, I am drowning in the sins of others," because to explain that burden would require revealing those sins, and he cannot do that, not ever. The seal is absolute. So Father Benedict carries his burden alone. He begins to write, not letters meant to be sent, but letters to God, or perhaps to himself, scratched onto pieces of parchment in Latin when he has parchment, on scraps of wood when he does not. He writes about the terrible loneliness of his office. He writes about the nights when he lies awake wondering if God truly hears all confessions, or if perhaps God, like Father Benedict himself, has grown weary of humanity's endless catalog of failings. He writes questions he cannot ask aloud. Does God forgive the priest who absolves a murderer, knowing the man will likely kill again? Does the seal of confession bind God, or only the priest? If a village burns because the priest knew of a plot but could not speak, whose sin is the greater, the arsonists or the priests? These writings, if they survived, would be hidden things, kept in locked boxes or tucked into the pages of books no one else would read. Most did not survive. Most were burned by their authors in moments of fear, or destroyed by their successors who understood the danger such texts represented. But some fragments remain, scattered through the archives of Europe, and they tell us that Father Benedict was not alone in his torment. The paradox deepened as the medieval church grew in power and sophistication. By the 13th century, confession had become not merely a practice, but a requirement, mandated by the Fourth Lateran Council in the year of our Lord, 1215. Every Christian of the Age of Reason was required to confess at least once a year during the Lenten season, to their parish priest. The requirement was backed by the threat of excommunication for non-compliance. The Church, in its wisdom or its hunger for control, perhaps both, had made the confessional the central instrument of pastoral care and social discipline. This transformed the priesthood. Now, hearing confessions was not an occasional duty, but a constant one. During Lent, priests heard confessions for hours each day, a relentless procession of souls seeking absolution. The confessional became a place where the entire social order revealed itself in intimate detail. The rich confessed their exploitation of the poor. The poor confessed their small acts of resistance and survival. Women confessed the secrets of their households. Men confessed their violence and their fears of inadequacy, heretical thoughts, sexual transgressions, economic crimes, betrayals of friendship, failures of charity. All of it poured into the priest's ears like a river that never stopped flowing. And the priest, bound by his vow, could damn none of it. He could not warn the village when he, learned in confession that the Lord planned to raise taxes to a crushing level. He could not intervene when a husband confessed to planning his wife's murder, as long as the murder remained only a plan. He could not even speak vaguely, could not say, "Someone in this village intends harm," without violating the seal. The seal demanded absolute silence. The knowledge remained trapped inside the priest, a secret kingdom of horrors and sorrows that he alone inhabited. But knowledge, as every medieval scholar knew, exerts pressure. It wants to be known, to be spoken, to be acted upon. The pressure of contained knowledge is like water sealed in a vessel and heated over a flame. Eventually, something must give. For some priests, the vessel was their faith itself. Consider the case of a priest we might call Father Thomas, whose story emerges from the records of a bishop's court in England in the late 12th century. Father Thomas served a prosperous parish in a market town. He was known as a learned man, a skilled preacher, a diligent administrator of the sacraments. For 15 years, he heard the confessions of merchants and craftsmen, of their wives and children and servants. He heard the confessions of travelers passing through, of pilgrims and peddlers and soldiers. He heard the confessions of the local Benedictine monks when their own abbot was unavailable. He heard everything, and he kept everything secret, until the day he walked into his church and found that he no longer believed any of it. The crisis of faith did not come suddenly, though it felt sudden when it finally broke through to his conscious mind. It had been building for years, a slow erosion of certainty worn away by the relentless testimony of human suffering and human cruelty that flowed through the confessional. Father Thomas had heard too many stories of children beaten, women violated, the weak crushed by the powerful. He had heard too many expressions of genuine remorse that led to no genuine change. He had heard too many confessions from men who committed the same sins year after year, seeking absolution like a magical eraser that cost nothing and changed nothing. He had also heard confessions from good people, people who agonized over small infractions, who wept over unkind words spoken in anger or moments of jealousy or failures to give alms to every beggar. He had seen the genuinely virtuous torment themselves, while the genuinely vicious slept soundly after a perfunctory confession. The system seemed inverted, broken, a machine that ground down the sensitive and armored the cruel. Father Thomas began to doubt the efficacy of confession itself. If absolution changed nothing, what was its purpose? If the sacrament was a conduit of divine grace, why did that grace seem to flow most freely to those who needed it least? If God heard every confession through the priest's ears, why did God permit such suffering to continue? Why did God not intervene, not speak through the priest, not offer some sign that any of this mattered? These doubts Father Thomas confessed to his own confessor, a monk in the nearby abbey. But the monk's response was not comforting. The monk told him that doubt was a temptation of the enemy, that faith meant believing without seeing, that his questions revealed a dangerous pride, an assumption that his finite human mind could judge the infinite wisdom of God. The monk prescribed additional prayers, more fasting, and stricter discipline. Father Thomas obeyed, but the doubts did not leave. They grew stronger, fed by every confession he heard. Eventually, Father Thomas made a decision. He could not continue as a priest while harboring such fundamental doubts. That would be a fraud, a betrayal of his vows and his office. But he could not leave the priesthood publicly, because that would require explaining his reasons, and explaining his reasons would mean revealing the things he had learned in confession that had led him to doubt. The seal bound him even in his apostasy. So, Father Thomas crafted a plan. He would feign illness, a slow decline that would make it necessary for him to retire from active ministry. He began to eat less, to walk with a stoop, to speak in a weakened voice. He requested an assistant priest to help with his duties, then gradually transferred more and more responsibility to the younger man. After 2 years of this performance, he retired to a small cottage on the edge of the parish, where he lived quietly, maintaining the appearance of a faithful priest in honorable retirement, while privately he had ceased to believe in any of it. This might have remained his secret, taken to the grave, except that Father Thomas made one mistake. He wrote it all down. Perhaps he needed to confess his own secret, even if only to a piece of parchment. Perhaps he hoped that someday someone would read his account and understand. He wrote a document he titled The Burden of Knowing, in which he detailed his crisis of faith and the circumstances that led to it. He was careful, even in this private document, not to violate the seal of confession by revealing specific sins or identifying specific penitents. But he wrote about the patterns he had observed, the systemic cruelties and hypocrisies, the way the confessional revealed the Church's sacraments to be powerless against the deep structures of sin. After Father Thomas's death, the document was discovered among his effects by his successor, who was horrified. The successor brought it to the bishop, who was equally horrified. Here was a priest who had lost his faith but continued in his office, absolving sins he did not believe were forgiven, administering sacraments he thought were meaningless, hearing confessions he considered futile. The bishop convened a secret tribunal to determine whether Father Thomas's posthumous heresy should be publicly condemned. which would mean his body would be exhumed and denied burial in consecrated ground. But the tribunal faced a problem. To condemn Father Thomas publicly would require explaining his heresy, and his heresy was rooted in his experience as a confessor. To explain adequately would risk weakening faith in the sacrament of confession itself. If ordinary Christians learned that a faithful priest had lost his belief because of what he heard in the confessional, they might begin to doubt as well. The tribunal decided after long deliberation to suppress the document and say nothing. Father Thomas's burden of knowing was locked in the bishop's archive, where it remained for centuries. A forbidden confession of a forbidden crisis of faith. But the price hadn't yet been paid. Father Thomas's case was unusual in its documentation, but it was not unusual in its substance. Throughout the medieval period, priests struggled with the burden of knowledge that confession placed upon them. Some, like Father Thomas, lost their faith. Others lost their minds. The archives contain occasional references to priests who became melancholy or mad, who began to speak in riddles, who withdrew from society, who died by their own hand. The records are circumspect, never stating outright that the burden of confession drove these men to despair. But the pattern is there for those who look closely. Some priests found other outlets for their burden. They turned to drink, seeking oblivion in wine or ale. They turned to illicit relationships, seeking human warmth and connection to counterbalance the cold isolation of their office. They turned to scholarship, burying themselves in theological texts as if the right interpretation of Augustine or Aquinas might resolve the contradictions they witnessed daily. They turned to mysticism, seeking direct experience of the divine that might bypass the corrupt and confusing channel of human confession. And some priests turned to writing, but not the kind of writing Father Thomas had attempted. They wrote theological treatises on the nature of the seal of confession, exploring its boundaries and implications with an intensity that suggests personal stake. They wrote manuals for confessors, guides that attempted to codify how a priest should respond to various types of confession, as if reducing the experience to a series of rules might make it manageable. They wrote in the margins of books, brief notes that hint at private struggles. Here I disagreed. This seems wrong. I have seen otherwise. One such marginal note, found in a 13th century manuscript of Peter Lombard's sentences, reads, "The seal binds the priest, but who binds the secret? It lives inside him like a second soul, darker than his own, knowing things his own soul wishes it did not know." The handwriting suggests a trained scribe, probably a priest or monk, copying the text for his monastery's library and unable to resist adding this cryptic confession in the margin. We don't know his name, we don't know his story, but we know he felt the burden. The burden was not merely psychological, it was also political and legal. As the medieval period progressed, secular authorities began to recognize that priests, through the confessional, had access to information that could be valuable for governance and control. Kings and lords began to pressure priests to reveal what they heard in confession when it pertained to matters of state, treason, plots, conspiracies. The priests bound by the seal refused. This refusal sometimes came at great personal cost. In the 14th century, during the conflicts between the French crown and the papacy, a priest in Paris found himself caught between earthly and spiritual authority. A nobleman had confessed to the priest that he was part of a conspiracy to assassinate the king. The nobleman showed genuine remorse and seemed sincere in his desire to abandon the plot, which is why he brought it to confession rather than simply remaining silent. The priest, following the proper theological guidance, told the nobleman that his absolution depended on his withdrawal from the conspiracy, and the nobleman agreed. But one of the king's spies, suspecting something, interrogated the nobleman's servants and learned that their master had visited the priest's confessional for an unusually long time. The spy reported this to the king's chancellor, who summoned the priest and demanded to know what the nobleman had confessed. The priest, a man named Father Guillaume, refused. The chancellor threatened him with imprisonment. Father Guillaume still refused. The chancellor then suggested that the king's agents might simply torture the information out of him, since the seal of confession was a church matter, and the king's need for security was a state matter, and surely state security took precedence. Father Guillaume responded with words that were recorded in the trial documents that followed. "You may break my body, but you cannot break the seal. Even if I spoke under torture, the words would be lies, for the seal prevents true speech. You would gain nothing but my pain and your own sin." The chancellor backed down, perhaps recognizing that torturing a priest over the seal of confession would create a scandal that would undermine the king's relationship with the church, which he could not afford during his conflict with the Pope. Father Guillaume was released, though he was watched carefully for the rest of his life. The nobleman's conspiracy was discovered through other means and crushed, and the nobleman himself was executed. Whether he would have withdrawn from the conspiracy as he promised in confession, we cannot know. Father Guillaume never spoke of it, but Father Guillaume did write about it years later in a letter to a fellow priest who was facing a similar situation in another city. The letter was preserved because the recipient donated it to his monastery's library, where it became part of a collection of correspondence on difficult cases of conscience. In the letter, Father Guillaume wrote, "The seal is not merely a rule we follow, it is the shape of our souls. To break it would be to break ourselves. We hold secrets not because we are strong, but because we have no choice. The secret holds us as much as we hold it." This understanding, that the seal transforms the priest, makes him a living vessel for others' sins and secrets, runs through medieval discussions of confession. The priest becomes a kind of sin-eater, taking into himself the moral pollution of his community, containing it so that it does not spread, but at the cost of carrying it forever. Some theological texts compared the priest to Christ, who took upon himself the sins of the world, but Christ's suffering led to resurrection and redemption. The priest's suffering led only to more suffering, more confessions, more secrets, an endless accumulation of burden until death. And even death might not bring relief. Medieval theology taught that the seal of confession persisted beyond the grave. Even in heaven, the saints who had been priests in life were bound not to reveal what they had heard in confession. The secrets remained secret eternally. This raised strange questions that theologians debated in the universities. If a saint in heaven knows a secret from confession, and an angel asks him about it, can the saint refuse to answer? Does the seal bind angels? Does it bind God? If God knows everything, does God know it as the priest knows it, or in some other way that bypasses the seal? These questions seem abstract, but they point to a deep anxiety about the nature of the confessional knowledge. It was knowledge that corrupted the knower simply by being known. It was knowledge that could not be shared, could not be acted upon, could not be resolved. It simply accumulated, a toxic treasure that the priest had no choice but to hoard. The burden deepened further when priests heard confessions from other priests. This happened regularly in monasteries and cathedral chapters, where priests lived in community and confessed to one another. A priest might confess to his brother priest that he had violated his vow of chastity, or that he had stolen from the church's treasury, or that he had doubts about doctrine, or that he had broken the seal of confession itself. The confessor priest now bore not only the original secret, but also the knowledge of his brother's sin, and he could speak of neither. If the sinning priest continued in his sin, the confessor could not warn the community or remove the sinner from his office. The seal bound him to silence. In some cases, this led to tragic consequences. There are records of priests who, having confessed to sexual abuse of children or vulnerable adults, were given absolution and penance by their confessor priests, but were not removed from positions where they could continue their abuse. The confessor priests, bound by the seal, could not act on the knowledge they had received in confession. They could offer counsel, urge the sinner to remove himself from temptation, assign severe penances, and pray for the sinner's conversion. But they could not force action, and they could not warn potential victims. Modern readers, aware of the scandals that have plagued the church in our own time, may see in these medieval cases a clear moral failure. And it is a moral failure, but one rooted in a principled commitment to the absolute seal of confession. The medieval church believed sincerely and deeply that the seal could admit no exceptions, because even one exception would destroy the entire system. If people knew that certain sins would be reported rather than sealed, they would not confess those sins, and they would die unshriven. The calculus was clear. Better to risk the continuation of some sins than to lose the possibility of absolution for all sins. But the priests who lived within this system, and who heard the confessions that tested it, knew the cost of that calculus in ways their bishops and theologians did not. They knew the names and faces of the victims. They knew the anguish of holding knowledge that could prevent harm, but being forbidden to use it. They knew the corrosive effect of complicity, even involuntary complicity, on their own souls. Some priests tried to find ways around the seal without technically breaking it. They might preach sermons that, while not identifying specific sinners or sins, addressed the patterns they saw in confession. A priest who heard many confessions of domestic violence might preach about the sin of cruelty to one's wife and the husband's duty to love as Christ loved the church. A priest who heard many confessions of usury might preach about the dangers of exploiting the poor. These sermons were permissible because they did not violate the seal. They revealed no specific confidence, but they were dangerous because they could be interpreted as indirect revelations. A sharp-eared parishioner might wonder why the priest suddenly preached about a particular sin and might begin to speculate about who in the parish had confessed it. Other priests tried to use the confessional proactively as a tool of moral formation. When they heard a confession of planned wrongdoing, they would make the granting of absolution conditional on the penitent's commitment to change course. This was theologically proper. Absolution required genuine contrition and firm purpose of amendment. But it placed the priest in the position of trying to manage behavior through the confessional, which added another layer of burden. Now he was not merely a passive repository of secrets, but an active agent trying to prevent harm while remaining bound to silence about the details of his efforts. The strain of all this sometimes broke through in unexpected ways. There are accounts of priests who, after hearing a particularly disturbing confession, would immediately leave the confessional and go to the church altar, where they would prostrate themselves in prayer for hours. There are accounts of priests who developed physical symptoms, chronic headaches, stomach ailments, insomnia, that seemed to correlate with their confessional duties. There are accounts of priests who, in their old age, became compulsive about the seal, reminding everyone around them constantly that they could reveal nothing, as if the fear of accidentally breaking the seal had become an obsession. One elderly priest in Germany in the 15th century became so anxious about the seal that he developed a habit of making the sign of the cross over his mouth after every conversation, whether it had involved confession or not, as if to seal his lips physically. His fellow priests found this behavior strange but harmless, a quirk of old age. But when he died and his possessions were examined, they found a small notebook in which he had written, over and over, in different languages and scripts, sigillum, seal, sagel, leso, hundreds of pages of the same word, as if by writing it enough times, he could make the seal strong enough to hold everything he had heard in 40 years of hearing confessions. But what of the secrets that priests wanted to tell? Not out of weakness or malice, but out of love. This is perhaps the most poignant category of forbidden confession. A priest might hear in confession that a beloved parishioner was dying of a hidden illness, or planning to leave the village forever, or carrying a secret sorrow that the priest wished he could help them share with their family. But the seal forbade it. The priest could only watch, helpless, as situations unfolded that might have been resolved with a word of warning or a moment of connection, if only he were free to speak. In the literature of the period, there are rare stories, told as moral fables, not as factual accounts, of priests who broke the seal out of love and were punished for it. These stories served as warnings, but they also acknowledged the temptation. One such story, found in a collection of exempla used by preachers, tells of a priest who heard a young woman's confession that she planned to enter a convent because she believed herself unloved by the man she desired. The priest happened to know, from another confession, that the man loved her deeply but was too shy to speak. The priest, wanting to bring happiness to both, hinted to the young woman that she might be mistaken about the man's feelings. The young woman questioned the man, they confessed their mutual love, and they married. But the priest's violation of the seal, however well-intentioned, was discovered, and he was defrocked and excommunicated. The story ends with the priest dying in misery while the couple he helped lived in happiness. A cautionary tale about the cost of mercy when it conflicts with law. Whether this story describes an actual event or is pure fiction is unclear, but it reflects a real tension that medieval priests experienced. The law that protected the integrity of confession also prevented them from acting on their pastoral instincts. They were shepherds who could not warn the flock of specific dangers, physicians who could not share their diagnoses, counselors who could not break confidences even to prevent harm. The role demanded a kind of heroic passivity, a willingness to know and not act, to hear and not speak, to suffer and not complain. Those who heard all confessions could confess to no one. This was the paradox at the heart of the medieval priesthood, and it shaped the inner lives of priests in ways that rarely left written traces. Most priests managed the burden through prayer, through the consolations of liturgy, through the bonds of clerical brotherhood, through the simple passage of time that dulled the sharp edges of even the most disturbing confessions. They endured because endurance was their duty, and because they believed, most of the time, that their suffering served a higher purpose. But some priests could not endure. Some broke under the weight, and when they broke, they faced a terrible choice: break the seal and be damned for it, or break themselves and suffer in silence. Most chose the latter. They became the hidden casualties of a system that demanded everything from them and could acknowledge nothing of their sacrifice. In the late medieval period, as literacy spread and written culture expanded, more priests began to keep journals or write letters in which they hinted at their struggles. These documents, when they survive, are extraordinarily moving. They show men trying to articulate an experience that was, by definition, inarticulable. They show faith tested to its limits and sometimes beyond. They show loneliness so profound that it becomes almost metaphysical, a loneliness not merely of circumstance, but of essence. The loneliness of being the only person in the world who knows certain things. One such journal, kept by an Italian priest in the 14th century, contains this passage: "I am become a living tomb, a vault of secrets that will crumble only when I do. I wonder sometimes if heaven will be relief or merely a larger tomb, where all the secrets of all the ages are kept by all the saints who heard them, each of us sealed in our knowledge, unable to speak even to one another. Is this what eternity means? An eternal keeping of secrets? If so, I fear heaven more than I fear hell." This is a remarkable confession, and a troubling one. It suggests that the burden of the seal had led this priest to doubt not merely the goodness of his office, but the goodness of eternity itself. If his experience as a confessor was so isolating and so painful, and if that experience was meant to be a participation in the divine work of redemption, what did that say about the nature of redemption? What did it say about God? These questions could not be asked in theological treatises or preached from pulpits. They could only be whispered in journals and letters, private explorations of private doubts. But they suggest that for some medieval priests, the seal of confession became a spiritual crisis, a test of faith that they might not pass. Yet most priests did pass it, or at least endured it. They heard confessions year after year, kept secrets decade after decade, and went to their graves with libraries of untold stories locked inside their memories. They found ways to live with the burden. They found meaning in their isolation, seeing it as a participation in Christ's own isolation in Gethsemane, where he prayed alone while his disciples slept. They found strength in the seal itself, understanding it not as a restriction, but as a sacred trust, a proof that God valued human confession enough to make it absolutely inviolable. They found peace in the belief that the secrets they kept were not lost, but held in God's perfect memory, where they would one day be understood and resolved in ways that human understanding could not achieve. These were the strategies of survival, the ways medieval priests made their burden bearable, and they worked most of the time, for most priests. The system held. Confession remained central to medieval religious life. The seal remained unbroken, or at least its breaking remained rare enough to seem exceptional. The priesthood continued to attract men who were willing to take on the burden, perhaps because they did not fully understand it until they had lived it, or perhaps because they trusted that grace would be sufficient for whatever came. But grace, as every priest knew from experience, was mysterious in its workings. Sometimes it sustained, sometimes it seemed absent. And in those absences, the priest was alone with his burden, alone in a way that few other human beings ever experienced. He was the keeper of secrets that could never be kept by anyone else, the bearer of knowledge that would die with him, the guardian of confessions that were themselves forbidden to confess. Let us return to the candle, that small light we imagined at the beginning of this journey. It has burned all this time, steady and quiet, illuminating the stone chamber where our medieval priest sits with his burden. The candle knows nothing of the secret spoken in this room. It simply burns, giving light, consuming itself slowly, inevitably. When it burns down to nothing, another candle will be lit to take its place. And then another, and another, a succession of lights that mark the passage of time, but reveal nothing of what that time contained. The medieval priest was like that candle, in a way. He gave light, the light of absolution, the light of sacramental grace, while consuming himself in the service of others. He heard their darkest confessions and gave them the comfort of forgiveness. And in doing so, he took their darkness into himself, where it burned like a slow fire, unseen by anyone but God. This, then, is the truth that the forbidden confessions reveal. Those who heard all confessions could confess to no one. Not fully, not freely, not in a way that could truly unburden them. They live between worlds, between the sacred and the profane, between knowledge and silence, between community and isolation. They were bridges that could never cross themselves, keys that could never unlock their own doors, physicians who could never heal their own wounds. The medieval church, in creating the seal of confession, created something magnificent and terrible. It created a space where any sin could be confessed and forgiven, where the worst of human nature could be brought into the light without fear of exposure or punishment. This was a genuine achievement, a mechanism of mercy in an often merciless age, but it also created a class of men who bore the cost of that mercy in their own souls, who became repositories of darkness so that others could walk in light. Were they victims? Were they heroes? Were they merely doing their duty? Perhaps all three. Perhaps the categories don't quite fit. What we can say is that they endured something difficult and strange, something that shaped them in ways visible only to themselves and to God. They lived lives of profound consequence. Every confession they heard mattered. Every absolution they granted had eternal weight. And yet, those lives remain largely hidden from history, because the seal that bound them in life continues to obscure them in death. The documents that survive, the fragments of journals, the marginal notes, the letters preserved by chance, give us glimpses of their inner worlds. We see pain, doubt, faith, endurance, loneliness, love. We see men struggling to remain human while performing a role that required them to be something more than human, or perhaps less than human, a function rather than a person, a vessel for grace rather than a soul with needs of its own. In the end, what do we learn from these forbidden confessions of medieval priests? Perhaps we learn that systems designed to manage human souls will always extract costs from those who operate them. We learn that secrecy, even sacred secrecy, creates isolation, and isolation creates suffering. We learn that the people we trust to hear our worst truths carry those truths as burdens we rarely acknowledge or understand. We learn that every role in society, even the most exalted, comes with hidden prices that only the role bearers themselves fully know. We learn, too, about the nature of faith under pressure. The medieval priest's faith was tested in a unique way, not by external persecution or intellectual doubt alone, but by the daily, grinding experience of human sinfulness without relief or resolution. Some priests lost their faith under this pressure, but many more kept it, finding in their very burden a reason to believe. If they were called to bear such weight, they reasoned, it must be for a purpose. If the seal demanded so much from them, it must protect something of great value. If their sacrifice was real, then the grace they mediated must also be real, even if they could not always feel it themselves. This is the paradox we return to one last time. Those who heard all confessions could confess to no one, but in that very isolation, they found a strange communion. They were alone, yes, but they were alone together. A scattered brotherhood of burden bearers who understood one another without needing to speak. When one priest looked into the eyes of another priest, they recognized something that the laity could never see: the weight, the weariness, the strange honor of being trusted with the untellable. And perhaps that recognition was enough. Perhaps it had to be enough, because the alternative, breaking the seal, sharing the burden, lightening the load by spreading the knowledge, would have destroyed the very thing they were trying to protect. The confessional worked because it was absolutely safe. It was absolutely safe because the priest was absolutely bound. The priest was absolutely bound because he understood himself to be serving something greater than his own comfort or even his own soul. Whether that service was worth the cost is a question each priest had to answer for himself in the darkness of his own conscience, where no one else could follow. The forbidden confessions we have explored tonight suggest that the answer was not always clear, was not always yes, was sometimes a desperate hope more than a settled certainty. But they also suggest that the question itself mattered, that the struggle to answer it was part of the priest's formation, part of his participation in the mystery he served. As we come to the end of our journey, let us return once more to the candle in the stone chamber. It has burned lower now, the wax pooling, the flame smaller, but still steady. In that small light, we can see the walls covered with shadows, the shadows of all the stories told in this place, all the confessions heard and kept and carried. The priest who sits here, whoever he is, whatever century he inhabits, knows those stories. He will take them to his grave, and there perhaps, in the mercy of God, he will finally be able to set them down, to confess at last the burden of having heard all confessions. The candle flickers, but does not go out. The secrets remain sealed, and the priest, faithful or faithless, saint or sufferer, endures another day, another confession, another secret added to the infinite library of silence he carries within. 5 gentle lessons we might take from these hidden lives. First, that power is not always visible or loud. The medieval priest's power to absolve sins was immense, but it came wrapped in silence and invisibility, in the humility of listening rather than speaking. Real power often looks like this: quiet, patient, hidden from view, operating in the gaps between public actions. Second, that trust requires sacrifice from those who receive it. We place our trust in doctors, lawyers, therapists, priests, and others who hold our secrets. But we rarely think about what it costs them to hold those secrets, to know what they know, to live with knowledge they cannot share. Trust is not free. Someone always pays the price. Third, that systems designed with perfect logic can create imperfect suffering. The seal of confession was logically necessary for the medieval sacramental economy to function. But logical necessity does not eliminate human cost. The most carefully designed systems still grind against the human souls that operate them, and we must attend to that grinding even when the system seems to work. Fourth, that isolation can be a form of service, but it remains isolation nonetheless. The medieval priest's lonely burden was holy, was meaningful, was chosen in faith, but it was still lonely. We should honor the lonely service of others without romanticizing the loneliness itself, and we should ask whether some forms of service require less isolation than we have historically demanded. Fifth, that the things we cannot say shape us as surely as the things we do say. The medieval priest was formed by his silences, by the confessions he heard and kept, by the burden of sealed knowledge. We are all formed by our secrets, by the things we know and cannot tell, by the gaps between our public and private selves. Understanding this might make us more gentle with one another, more aware that everyone carries hidden weight. These are lessons from a distant age, from a world of stone churches and Latin prayers, of pilgrimages and relics, of a faith so woven into daily life that it shaped every thought and action. That world is gone, but the human experiences it contained, of faith and doubt, burden and endurance, isolation and connection, secrets kept and souls shaped. These experiences remain recognizable. We may not hear confessions in wooden boxes, but we hear them in therapy offices, in conversations with friends, in the privacy of our own consciences. We may not seal them with sacred vows, but we seal them nonetheless, with discretion or shame, or the simple sense that some things are too tender or too terrible to speak aloud. The medieval priest, then, is not as distant from us as he might first appear. He is our ancestor in the work of listening, in the burden of knowing, in the discipline of silence. His forbidden confessions, the ones he could never make, the inner life he could never fully share, echo in the silences of our own lives, in the things we know but cannot say, in the burdens we bear for the sake of others or simply because we have no choice. The candle burns down to its last inches of wax. The flame grows smaller, the light dimmer, but still it persists. Still it illuminates the stone chamber where so many secrets have been spoken and kept. And then, at last, the flame goes out. Darkness returns to the chamber, but in the morning, another candle will be lit, and the cycle will begin again. Light and darkness, confession and silence, burden and endurance, the endless work of hearing and holding, of knowing and not telling. This is the way it was for centuries, in countless churches across Christendom, wherever a priest sat in a confessional box and listened to the sins of his people and kept them sealed in his soul until death released him, or did not release him, but simply transferred the burden from earthly keeping to eternal keeping, from the isolation of life to the mystery of eternity. Those who heard all confessions could confess to no one. But perhaps in the end, their unspoken confessions are heard by the only one who needed to hear them, held by the only one who could truly bear them, understood by the only one who knew both the necessity of the burden and the faithfulness of those who carried it. The road we've walked tonight leads back to where it started, to the dim light and the invitation to settle in, to rest, to let the weight of the medieval world settle gently over us like a blanket, heavy but not crushing, ancient but not distant. The forbidden confessions of medieval priests are sealed still, sealed in archives and in the silence of history, but they have spoken to us nonetheless, in fragments and hints, in the spaces between what was written and what was lived. And now, as you prepare to rest, carry with you this image: a priest in a stone church, a candle burning low, shadows on the walls, and inside the priest's soul, a library of secrets that will never be spoken. A burden carried in faith or in duty, or simply because there is no other choice. Sleep knowing that burdens have been carried before and will be carried again. That silence has been kept, that faithfulness has endured, that the candle, however small, continued to burn. Return whenever you wish, and we'll walk another road through the medieval world, finding together the hidden stories that shaped our world and that still echo, faintly but persistently, in the chambers of our own hearts.